Hi, I'm Jeff Strong. I'm creator of the Auditory Brain Stimulation Therapy Rhythmic Entrainment Intervention. I'm also co-founder and creative director of BrainShiftRadio.com. For the last 30 years, I've been working with drumming to influence the brain and behavior. And a lot of my clients that I work with have sensory processing issues. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about how I approach these issues with the fast, complex drumming rhythms and our REI Custom Program. Sensory processing can be broken down into three basic categories. The first is hypersensitivity. This is where you're over-responsive to the environment, where the sensory input you're receiving is too much to handle. And you can lash out, you can act out, you can retreat, but it becomes overwhelming too quickly. And then the second type is hyposensitivity. This is where we're under-responsive to sensory input, where we just either don't perceive the input that we're receiving, or we just are not getting enough of it to really have any kind of an impact on us. And the third type is sensory discrimination. And this is where it's related to the hyposensitivity, but it's really being unable to really discriminate the actual input that you're receiving. So you may hear something, but you may not understand. Or you may have tactile input that you can't discern. A classic example is you can't feel textures very well. And so you may feel something, but you can't discern what it is. So that's discrimination. And it's really, like I said, connected to hyposensitivity. So when we look at it, we're really looking at those two connected. And then we're looking at the hypersensitivity being connected with levels of anxiety and anxiety-based behaviors. So the first thing we do when we do an intake for someone, when we're looking at their sensory profile, we're looking at where they're oversensitive and undersensitive to sensory input. And that really creates the basis in a lot of ways for how we approach the custom program in general. You know, when we do our full-blown custom program, and you may or may not know this, but we are looking at a profile along a whole spectrum of 10 different symptom categories. Everything from calm or focus to social interaction, to language or communication, to the sensory issues. And so the sensory profile is just a small piece of what we're looking at. So if we're looking at somebody who is not communicating very well and they have sensory issues, we're kind of balancing these out. So to bring that around, if somebody is highly anxious, it's unlikely that they're under-responsive to sensory input. They're rarely hyposensitive. They may be hyposensitive in one area, but they're going to be hypersensitive in another area. And that's going to be where a lot of times you're going to see their anxiety. So if there's any hypersensitivity at all, we're going to start with anxiety. We're going to start with calming the nervous system and organizing the nervous system. If there's no anxiety and we have a hyposensitive sensory system, we're probably looking at somebody who doesn't have a lot of communication ability or is not very good at social interaction because they're under-responsive to their environment in general. So we're going to give them a higher level of stimulation to begin with to kind of get them to activate a little bit. And then we're going to work on discrimination there to be able to help them understand and see the nuances in things. So that's contrasted with the hypersensitivity, where we're really looking at turning down the knob on their sensory their sensory volume and letting them get not overwhelmed by the sensory input so they can then respond in a more appropriate way to their environment. Two very different approaches. So I'm going to start by playing some rhythms here I use for hypersensitivity. Like I said, that's really calm. We're getting the nervous system to be calmed. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a kind of a predictable pattern that's going to allow for the nervous system to kind of relax into this alpha state of consciousness, because we want to entrain the brain to this point. And so we do that by having the underlying tempo at 8 beats per second. But in order to help facilitate that process with calm, I want rhythms that have kind of a predictable musicality to them. They can't be so repetitive that they become something the brain will shut out, but we want it to be not so complex that it becomes jarring, that it becomes too activating for a nervous system that is already overactivated, because that's what people with hypersensitivity are. So I'll play a little bit. I'll play for a minute or so, give you a feel for what this feels like. And you'll see the calm in it almost immediately, I'm sure. You probably heard some themes in that. One of the things you probably noticed most obviously was when I did a double bass. I'm putting it in different spots. It doesn't necessarily fit into a 4/4 time in a predictable pattern that you know when it's coming. But each time it happens, it feels comforting. That's kind of the idea here with dealing with hypersensitivity with sensory issues. You'll notice this rhythm, if you've listened to any of my other videos where I talk about calm, you'll notice these rhythms were a little bit in and out of a regular time signature. Most music, for instance, is in 4/4 time. And it can be counted 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a. And so it'll be like this. And to bring in that boom boom, I'll play a mambo type pattern in 4/4. You can hear what it sounds like. There's a regularity to it that you can predict. You know it's coming up. What I tried to do is I tried to take that boom boom and move it around a little bit. So it's not always so predictable, but when it happens, it feels familiar and it's comforting. That's the idea from the starting point of dealing with somebody with a hypersensitivity in their sensory system. And then I'll vary it, and I've got a whole bunch of different rhythms I use, depending on where it fits within the sensory system, whether it's auditory, tactile, or whatever. And then as well, I'll also be growing that rhythm over time. So like I said, the custom program, each recording is custom made, but we do 12 of them over the course of the complete program. And what we want to do is we want to progressively build on the stimulation from one recording to the next, so that over time, that person's become much stronger in their ability to process what sensory input we're giving them. So the rhythms I'll play in the first recording are going to be much simpler in their format than, say, the 7th or 8th or even the 12th. So each one gets more complex, in other words. So what I played here was something you'd find most likely in the first or second recording, when we're trying to calm the nervous system a little bit, but we're just trying to shake it up enough to not be just solely calm. So that's the idea. Hyposensitivity and sensory discrimination are a whole different approach. And what I'll do there is I've got more chaotic rhythms and more sharper tones. You're going to hear more slap tones. You're going to hear a lot of odd meter happening. Odd meter is anything out of 4/4 time. 4/4, if you break it down into 16th notes, is 16 16th notes. So to make it simple, if I did a 15/16 or a 17/16 instead of the 16/16, it throws that pulse off that you're used to hearing. Because we're used to being able to hear these downbeats in a 16th note pattern. We're not going to be hearing da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. We're hearing 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and we're hearing these downbeats because we want to break it down into cycles that are repeatable and predictable and not so fast that we're jarring our own nervous systems. So after all that explanation, let me play for you a little bit of a hyposensitivity rhythm, and you'll notice how much different it is from the other. As a matter of fact, let me start just shortly, briefly, playing the hypersensitivity kind of rhythm what we'd have early on in the program. Again, this is in kind of a smoothly varying pattern with a predictable piece once in a while. In this case, I'll put that bass in again, boom, boom. So it'll go like this. So kind of like that. And then hyposensitivity, like I said, is much more chaotic. It'll sound like this. So it's odd groupings, a lot of 3 in there. So in 2 and 3, just throwing it off into odd groupings that become even less predictable, but are also more activating. Now, if you're somebody who has a sensitive nervous system and you tend to be more towards the hypersensitive side, things in your world get overwhelming. I'm sure this felt a little uncomfortable to you. If you're somebody who's hyposensitive, who needs a lot of sensory input, the first one might have felt just kind of boring. This one might have felt a little bit more engaging and energizing for you. That's kind of the difference between the 2. And again, when I'm working on a custom program, from one recording to the next through the series, it's going to get more intense, more, I don't want to say the word chaotic, but in some ways chaotic, because we want the nervous system to not know what's happening next. It's the unpredictability of it that activates the brain. And that's the real key when you're dealing with hyposensitivity. So both these recordings are going to be about 8 beats per second. You can vary with tempos. I did a video earlier where I talked about the different tempos that we use in BrainShift Radio, from 8 to 12 beats per second, to have an activating effect that's a little different than the custom program, where everything is 8 beats per second. So there's a couple ways of going about doing it. If you're a drummer and you're playing for other people, just keep in mind that whenever you want to calm the nervous system, you need a musical predictability. It can't be repetitive, but it needs to have a comforting predictability to it. It has to be musical in the way it's presented. If you're trying to activate the brain, you want as much unpredictability as you can bring into it. And you want to ideally vary the tempo a little bit as well. So that's the basic idea here. I'm going to end with more of a calming rhythm for those of you who got a little overwhelmed by this last bit that I played here. But if you're interested in more about this, just definitely check out our REI Custom Program. You'll see a link below. Or try brainshiftradio.com. It's a great place to start getting used to my music and seeing the variability that can come in to what I play. So until then, I'll see you in the next video.